This is part 2 of a presentation on restoring water quality in the Conesus and Honeoye Lakes. This part will focus on water quality concerns for these lakes and on the TMDL development process. Both Conesus and Honeoye Lakes were listed on the New York State through 3D list of impaired waters in 2002 for oxygen demand and in 2006 for phosphorus. The New York State TMDL program is currently in the process of refocusing its resources, with our initial efforts being directed towards protecting and restoring sources of drinking water and those water bodies which are impaired by nutrients. Both Conesus Lake and Honeoye Lake meet both of these criteria. In mid-2014, funding became available through the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in the form of contractor support. These lakes were selected as part of the work which will be completed. The work itself is primarily being done by a contractor to the U.S. EPA with assistance from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. This presentation is being used to introduce the project to the public and to gather input. New York State has a narrative water quality standard for phosphorus. That standard reads, none in amounts which will result in growths of algae, weeds, and slimes that will impair the waters for their best usages. Within these lakes, the concern is due primarily to algae and harmful algae blooms. But submerged aquatic vegetation, or weeds, may also be of concern. With respect to the dissolved oxygen impairment, it is possible that the low levels of dissolved oxygen which have been observed are caused by the nutrient-driven impacts. But it is also possible that some or all of it is a result of natural conditions. This is something we hope to be able to figure out with this TMDL. Phosphorus can have several impacts on water quality. Phosphorus typically originates from the watershed, which then results in increased amounts of phosphorus in the lake. In most lakes in New York State, phosphorus is the nutrient which limits biological growth. Once additional phosphorus is added, it can often lead to increased growth of algae. As this algae dies, it will sink to the bottom of the lake where it decomposes. This decomposition consumes oxygen. So if you have enough algae decaying, it can consume all of the oxygen in the bottom waters of the lake. Once the oxygen in the bottom of the lake is gone, phosphorus trapped in the sediments is released and can make its way back into the water column. When a lake mixes from top to bottom, this phosphorus can again be available to support the growth of algae, exacerbating the algae growth problem. This cycle of phosphorus decay, oxygen consumption, and phosphorus release from the sediments can lead to internal loading, a process in which phosphorus already in the lake can continue to cycle through this process and continue to support algae growth. It is important to note, however, that at the concentrations we see in the environment, phosphorus itself has no direct impact on the water quality or aquatic life. But it does support the growth of algae, and it's the algae that tends to lead to all of the other impacts that we observe. One concern arises when a water body is used as a source of drinking water. Chlorine is added to the water to disinfect it, but the chlorine can also react with the algae found in the water. This reaction can cause disinfection byproducts, which are regulated by the US EPA. So when there's excess amounts of algae in the water, this can lead to problems with its use for drinking water. Excess amounts of algae can also cause problems for recreation. It can reduce clarity, it can increase the likelihood of algae blooms. Excess phosphorus can also help support aquatic plant growth, and algae can also impair the overall aesthetics of the lake. Finally, there can also be impacts to the aquatic life in the lake. In that internal phosphorus cycle, as the algae dies and decays, it can consume oxygen in the bottom waters of the lake. For the aquatic life which lives on the lake bottom, or the fish who seek refuge in the colder bottom lake waters, low or no dissolved oxygen poses a threat towards their continued survival. In order to develop a TMDL, we need to know about the watershed and how it's used, and about the water body and its characteristics. To do this, we bring together many different information sources. Land use in the watershed is often a key driver of pollutant loads, so we need to know how much of the watershed is urban or forested, and so on. We need to know if there are wastewater treatment plants in the watershed and how much phosphorus they discharge. The number and use of residential septic systems can be an important aspect of the phosphorus loads, so knowing where they are and how many people they serve over the year can be important. Weather data is important as water movement is often the delivery mechanism for nutrients from the watershed into the water body. Other characteristics, such as size of the watershed, soil type, and slope are also important factors. Lake characteristics are important, including size, depth, and residence time. And finally, water quality sampling data is important so that we can match the models to what is actually being observed. Common sources of phosphorus that we try to capture with all of the input includes wastewater treatment plants, septic systems, agricultural operations, often due to manure and fertilizer application. Groundwater also contains a small amount of natural phosphorus, but can also be influenced by how the overlying land is used. Stormwater runoff can contain different amounts of phosphorus depending on the land use, such as developed lands or forest. Erosion of stream banks can contain phosphorus, since there's often some phosphorus attached to the soil particles. Lake sediments can also contain phosphorus. When those sediments are resuspended into the water column, this phosphorus can be reintroduced back into the lake. Phosphorus contained in the sediments can also be released directly when the lake chemistry changes. In order to understand the problem and to develop a restoration strategy, we use both a land surface model and a lake model. For the watershed models, for these TMDLs, we're using the Soil and Water Assessment tool, which was developed by Texas A&M University. So we'll start with all of the above data sets and run a simulation for several years. This will give us a good idea of how the watershed responds under a range of conditions. The output we get from the models will be daily values of stream flow, phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment loads. So we can use this model to determine how much phosphorus is being delivered now, but we can also use it to estimate how this may change as the watershed changes. The watershed model then feeds into the lake model. For these TMDLs, we are using the CE-Qual W2 lake model developed by Portland State University. This is a fairly complex hydrodynamic and water quality model. It breaks the lake up into a bunch of little boxes and then models water movement and water quality in each of these little boxes. The model will produce a number of water quality parameters, including phosphorus concentrations, chlorophyll A concentrations, water quality, temperature, and dissolved oxygen. We can use this model to understand how the lake will respond as the external nutrient load changes. TMDL development is a long process, and we are just beginning. Right now, we are gathering data. We've already reviewed a number of reports and data sets. This presentation is also part of the initial information gathering. At the end of the presentation will be an opportunity for you to provide us with additional information. After this, we will move into the model development phase, where we will calibrate and validate the models and make comparisons to the existing data to make sure the models are an acceptable representation of what we observe in the environment. Once we have the models, we will run a number of different scenarios. We can look at things like historic conditions before the watershed was significantly developed. We can look at current conditions over a number of years or weather patterns. And we can develop some restoration scenarios to figure out what actions should be taken. With all that, we'll come up with a draft report, again with the goal of addressing all of EPA's 9-element watershed plans. It will include descriptions of the problem, an assessment of current conditions, and an allocation of the allowable load, and an implementation load for the load reductions. Once we have the draft ready, we'll have an official public comment period and intend to have another public meeting. This will be an opportunity for the public to weigh in on the plan we are developing. Our goal is for this to occur during the summer of 2015. The final step is to revise the report based on the public comments we receive and then to submit it to EPA. I need to take a moment to acknowledge the contributions of Professor Makarowitz and his students from the SUNY College at Brockport. He created a watershed model of the larger Genesee River, which is forming the basis of this work. You can access that work through the Digital Commons at Brockport by searching for the Genesee River Watershed Project. I'd also like to acknowledge both the SUNY College at Brockport and the Research Foundation for the State University of New York for making this work available to us.